So you know the story, right? Christopher Columbus returns from his famous voyage, and he's hailed as a hero. He's found a golden paradise. But what happened next? Well, that's where the story gets a lot darker. It wasn't a paradise. It was an invasion, a total collapse, and a biological collision that would forever change, well, everything.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break this whole thing down into 6 key parts that followed that one fateful voyage. We'll start with that hero's triumphant return, and we'll end up seeing how our modern world was literally stitched together through both violence and disease.
All right, so let's set the scene. Our story doesn't actually start on a creaky ship in the middle of the ocean. Nope, it starts in the royal court of Spain, with Columbus at the absolute height of his fame, about to present proof of a world that nobody in Europe even knew existed.
I want you to really picture this. It's April 1493. Columbus is parading through the streets of Barcelona like a rock star, a conquering hero. I mean, this guy did the impossible. He sailed across the Sea of Darkness and actually came back. He's standing before King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, not as some desperate sailor anymore, but as the admiral of the ocean sea. And get this, look at the proof he brings back with him. This isn't just spices and silk. He's got these brilliantly colored parrots, bizarre golden masks, and then, most shockingly, 6 terrified Taíno natives. They were kidnapped, dragged across an ocean, just to be put on display like living trophies. This was his evidence of a so-called new world.
The king and queen, they absolutely ate it up. They were so impressed, they immediately funded a second voyage. But this was a whole different animal. The first trip was a desperate gamble with 3 tiny ships. The second was a full-blown invasion force. A massive fleet of 17 ships, packed with 1,200 men. We're talking soldiers, priests, colonists, all sent with one goal: claim the land and get the gold.
So as Columbus sets sail again, he's feeling pretty good about himself. He's thinking he's returning to this paradise he's left behind. He's imagining the 39 men he left at his little fort, La Navidad, are now dripping with gold, living in peace, just waiting for him to show up. He could not have been more wrong. But that whole dream of paradise, yeah, it's about to get absolutely shattered. When Columbus's massive fleet finally arrives, they aren't greeted with cheers and celebration. They're met with a chilling, deathly silence. It's November 1493. The fleet reaches the coast of what we now call Hispaniola. But there's no welcome party. There's no fort. There's nothing. Just charred wood and ash. The settlement of La Navidad had been burned to the ground. Every single one of the 39 men Columbus left behind was dead. So what on earth happened here? Well, it turns out the Spanish sailors hadn't exactly been model guests. They'd been roaming the islands, stealing gold, and violently assaulting the Taíno women. Finally, a local chief, a man named Caanabo, decided enough was enough. He united his people, and he wiped the settlement off the map. Any fantasy of a peaceful exchange was officially over. This discovery, it changed everything. Columbus wasn't just an explorer anymore. Now, he was a furious governor with an army. He was going to find his gold, and he was going to punish the Taíno people for daring to fight back. And this led to one of the most brutal systems of colonial exploitation you can imagine. What he put in place was this unbelievably cruel system. The logic was simple and just brutal. Every single Taíno adult had to bring him a hawk's bell. It's a little bell they used for falconry, filled with gold dust every 3 months. If you did it, you got a copper token to wear on your neck, basically a receipt. If you failed, if you showed up without your token, they cut your hands off and just left you to bleed to death.
But here's the thing. The whole system was a setup. It was doomed from the start because there just wasn't that much gold on the island. It was an impossible task. So to escape this brutal punishment, the Taíno fled into the mountains, leaving their farms behind. That led to a massive famine. Between the Spanish swords, starvation, and even mass suicides, the entire native population of Hispaniola just collapsed. But as horrifying as the sword was, it wasn't even the biggest killer. No, the biggest killer was something you couldn't even see.
And that invisible killer, well, that brings us to something so huge. Historians call it the Columbian Exchange. Think about it. This wasn't just 2 groups of people meeting. This was like 2 separate planets colliding. It's maybe the biggest ecological event since the dinosaurs went extinct. Seriously.
You have to understand, for thousands and thousands of years, the Old World, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World, the Americas, they had evolved in total isolation. And then, boom, They crash into each other. Europe brings over horses, pigs, cattle, wheat, things that completely change the American landscape. But they also brought their germs. In return, the Americas gave the rest of the world things like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, foods that would change Europe forever. But the most devastating part of this whole exchange, it wasn't the food, it wasn't the animals, it was disease. The people living in the Americas had zero, absolutely no immunity to old world diseases like smallpox or the measles. The result was a biological apocalypse. The best estimate for the death toll within that first century is a staggering 90%.
I mean, just look at this chart. This isn't just a number. It's a catastrophe on a scale it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Entire civilizations, cultures, languages just vanished, wiped out by these invisible pathogens, sometimes before they even laid eyes on a European.
And here is the really twisted irony in all of this. Those New World crops, like potatoes and corn, they were super high in calories and easy to grow. So they get taken back to Europe, and what happens? They end centuries of famine and lead to a massive population explosion. And all those extra people? They provided the manpower for the very empires that would go on to conquer the Americas.
Okay, so after all of this, have you ever stopped to wonder? If Columbus is the guy who started this whole chain reaction, why isn't it called Columbia? Why do we call it America? Well, the answer comes down to one man's stubbornness and another man's brilliant realization.
Well, it really comes down to this. Christopher Columbus, he went to his grave completely convinced he had found a shortcut to Asia. He just would not accept that he'd found something new. But another Italian explorer, a guy named Amerigo Vespucci, he wasn't so blinded by his own ideas.
Vespucci sails down the coast of South America, and he's paying attention. He's looking at the stars, the coastline, and he realizes this doesn't match any map of Asia. This is something else entirely. He writes this famous letter, and in it he uses two simple Latin words that would change everything: mundus novus, a new world.
And that letter, it makes its way across Europe and lands on the desk of a German mapmaker named Martin Waldseemüller. It's 1507, he's drawing this revolutionary new map of the world, and he needs a name for this giant new landmass. So in honor of the guy who actually figured out what it was, he takes the name Amerigo, makes it Latin and feminine, and calls it America. And, well, the name just stuck. And there you have it. You see how all these different threads, the hero's welcome, the nightmare at the fort, the gold, the germs, even a mapmaker's choice, they all start to weave together into the world we live in right now.
Look, the legacy of Columbus it's messy, right? He was, without a doubt, a brilliant and courageous navigator. He was also a horrifically brutal governor who kicked off a genocide. But if you strip all that away, the one undeniable consequence of his voyage in 1492 is this: he stitched the planet together. Before him, you had two worlds. After him, for better and for much, much worse, you had one.
You know, it's funny. Columbus died in 1506, feeling like a total failure, mostly forgotten. He had no idea, zero clue, that his one journey had lit the fuse of globalization and created the incredibly complex, interconnected, and often painful world we all share today. Which kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on. If our modern world is like a giant tapestry woven from all these connections, what is the real price of pulling on just a single fateful thread?